And now, our feature presentation.
Hey everybody, what's going on? Welcome to another edition of B30 back in your life. Man, it's good to be back on the interwebs. So I was reading up on my computer about this weekly advice column from a Christian magazine where this pastor slash counselor provides answers to questions submitted by subscribers. Now, there's this one young man who emails this pastor, Eddie Koffels, explaining he's a sophomore in college, and in the upcoming semester, he'll be living in a house with two girls because they are, quote, some of his truest friends. They know how to help take care of a house, and I'm guessing they're probably on time with the rent money and stuff. But more importantly, there's absolutely zero sexual tension. But when this young man consulted his local church's pastor for advice, the pastor said he had to make new living arrangements immediately because this living situation would be hostile to his faith. However, when the young man told his parents about his living situation, they reassured him, and I'm just paraphrasing here, that they trust him and they know his intentions are pure and that he won't be sinning or go to hell for living with two girls. I mean, it's pretty obvious this young man isn't trying to get laid here, but what should this young man do? Is this young man's pastor onto something? However, the parents who raised this young man know that he is mature and just making a smart decision on having good roommates that won't complicate his living situation. Well, the faithful and reasonable thing to do here as good Christians is to appeal to the authority of Scripture to find a solution. Unfortunately, the Bible doesn't explicitly address the topic of cohabitation. Neither does it say it's a sin, nor does it say you could go to hell for it. Besides, the Middle East / ancient Near Eastern culture during the Old Testament and New Testament times were predominantly patriarchal, aka male-dominated society. So as terrible as this may sound, women were a commodity back then. They're essentially at the mercy of their fathers or husbands, either as domestic laborers, baby makers, or married off to forge alliances. I mean, there were some rare instances in the New Testament era where, for example, say the Book of Acts or something, there were some land-owning, prestigious, wealthy female aristocrats with social status. I think Lydia was one of the few. But anyways, my point is the specific historical, cultural setting of the biblical era probably won't help us answer this topic of male-female cohabitation in the modern era. So I guess we'll have to lean heavily on the pastor / counselor / host of this weekly column to be the voice of authority. So what advice did Pastor Koffels give? Well, surprise, surprise, the pastor who hosts the weekly advice column agrees with the original pastor who advised the young man to bail on living with female roommates. And why is this the safer and wiser decision, you ask? Well, here's the rationale. Even though Scripture never addressed the topic of having roommates of the opposite sex, the Bible does warn us about the sin of sexual immorality, and living with women often gives the opportunity for temptation of sexual immorality to arise. Even though the young man said there was no sexual tension, there's no way he is totally right about that or can give like 100% guarantee. I mean, anything could happen over time as you grow in your friendship. Something may develop, or maybe it's a less gradual and more accidental situation. If I had to guess what the pastors were afraid of, it's that cliche romantic comedy plot line where the female roommate had like a bad breakup or is like going through some quarter-life crisis. And then the male guy goes to console her. And then next thing you know, there's like a movie marathon in your apartment. And there's like drinks. And you guys are like cuddling and snuggling on the couch or something of the platonic nature. But one thing leads to another and bam, babies are made. No, I'm just kidding. But probably feelings develop and things get complicated. Kind of like when Joey had a crush on Rachel during the later seasons of Friends. Anyways, the young man's pastor and the advice column pastor strongly feel that this young man should err on the side of caution and not play the odds. So don't live with roommates with the opposite sex. Now, Pastor Eddie also provides a second reason why the young man should change his living arrangements, and here it is. Because it looks bad, and people could misunderstand his living situation. Pastor Eddie claims every Christian is called to be a reflection of Christ in your sphere of influence. If people see that you're living with two women, or vice versa, a woman living with two men, two things could happen. First thing is, some may assume the truth, that you're just simply roommates and there's nothing going on. Or the second thing is, worst case scenario, people assume the opposite and, there's something going on. And if they know that you're a Christian, you basically discredit Christianity and you're a hypocrite. So advice column pastor Eddie, in sum, tells the young man the right thing to do here is don't live with female roommates. But ultimately, the decision is in the young man's hands. Well, when I first heard these two reasons for not having roommates of the opposite sex, I couldn't but see some inherent flaws in Eddie's advice. But then again, what do I know? I'm just some nut job with like a social science background who's always been skeptical of the classic vanilla flavor, clean cut, I got my life together pastors. However, I did spend 5 years in a graduate theological institution, so just hear me out on these couple points. So the pastors here are saying, let's not even give that temptation of sexual immorality the smallest chance of emerging in your life. Prevention is 100% guarantee that no funny business would come about with the roommates. I see the value in that, but let's be mature and practical here. If this poor young man takes the pastor's advice, this means this guy will have to move out and start over with a roommate and housing search, find new roommates, new rental property, agreeing on the rent price, and security deposits, and then figuring out with new roommates who does the chores and etc. Man, sorting out those arrangements could take on a good turnout, maybe 2 to 3 weeks. And during that time, you're probably figuring out your tuition payments, buying textbooks, registering for courses, moving your belongings, and furnishing your place. And let's not forget, if this young man did bail on these two female roommates, these two ladies are pretty much screwed over too. They have to scramble to get a new roommate, arrange for viewings and visits, and worst case scenario, if they don't find a roommate in time, they have to pay more rent money to compensate for having one less person living with them. So I understand the potential for temptation, but there is a higher priority at stake here. I mean, finding a decent rental property at a reasonable price and roommates who aren't like potential serial killers and slobs and late rent payers is so hard to come about. Let's give the youth of this generation the benefit of the doubt here, that they would not let some potential sexual tension jeopardize the importance of a stable and secure living situation. Now, as for the argument of upholding this Christian image of purity and piety and not giving people the wrong impression that we're shacking up with like members of the opposite sex, I personally, and that is personally underlined with all caps, feel that's kind of dumb. I mean, we need to shed these pop culture misconceptions of North American youth who only care about cutting class and like doing keg stands and getting laid. I mean, post-secondary education is expensive. If you have to worry about keeping up with appearances that you are a pure Christian, it will become pretty unrealistic and silly when you're scrambling to find affordable housing and roommates with decent character. Besides, if your co-ed roommates are Christians, let's give them some credit that they are not a slave to the lusts of their flesh and are mature enough to know that having a secure and stable living situation is far more important than some brief moment of sensual pleasure. And even if your opposite sex roommates are or were non Christian, it doesn't mean they are lacking in moral values. I mean, college and university life is so hard. You're keeping up with your studies, making rent payments, doing laundry, cooking for yourself, maybe taking up a part time job for additional costs. Who has time to act out that cliche romantic comedy scene on the couch? At the end of the day, who really cares what other people think? It's kind of like that gospel account of the guy who's praying to God with the door or window open so people could see how devoted he was. If you are truly a stand-up Christian, even if neighbors know that you live with roommates of the opposite sex, your integrity and righteousness would shine through, and it would be obvious that you're not shacking up with chicks, so to speak, just to get some action. Now, what's interesting here is I was a housing coordinator at a theological grad school in the Pacific Northwest, and one way Christians handled this living with the opposite sex situation was doing the age-old, time-tested concept of community houses. Basically, a group of students, a minimum of 4 people with equal gender/sex representation, so 2 male, 2 female, would rent a 2-floor house. But bear in mind, the community houses that I oversaw or assisted in were occupied primarily by Christians who were focused on community and earning their master's degrees, so the idea of any funny business was so out of the question. But the point here is the community house culture eliminates any isolated 1 male, 1 female, 2 female, 1 male, or like 2 male, 1 female situations where sexual tension may occur, and thus Christians having roommates of the opposite sex was really no big deal at all because the community house atmosphere bred maturity, responsibility, and accountability, and it naturally weeded out any shady characters with impure intentions. Now, you may argue that things could go wrong for a bunch of 18 to 22-year-old non-Christian undergrads who are at an age to do some self-discovery, which may include exploring their sexual boundaries. But I guess it depends on the personal beliefs and values of the roommates. You know, how many are Christian, and even if they are immature, you probably don't want them as roommates anyways, regardless of their biological sex. Long story short, I think Christians can have roommates of the opposite sex. If your co-ed roommates are non-Christian or newly converted and don't have a strong foundation in resisting temptation, then the pastoral advice has some value. But if they are Christian and the male-female representation or ratio is like 50-50, we're all mature adults here. It shouldn't be an issue, right? I'm going to stop here. I would love to hear what you folks think, so feel free to drop a comment below. Check out the Facebook page, Twitter account for the latest news and updates of all things B30. So, all right, show's over, and bye.